This episode is sponsored by the Expert Services Directory. Are you a coach, consultant, speaker, or trainer who wants to sell your services to corporate clients across the UK, but you're booking fewer than 5 qualified sales calls from your lead generation each month? Or finding that all of your inbound inquiries are coming from junior employees in firms who just want to benchmark your pricing rather than actually introduce you to the real decision maker who has the buying power to get you in? And you really want to generate real qualified inbound inquiries from decision makers in organisations around the UK who actually have buying power and want to purchase your services as an external supplier? Well, that is exactly what the Expert Services Directory is for. And if you visit www.expertservicesdirectory.com and sign up now, you can generate qualified corporate leads for 12 whole months by being part of the Expert Services Directory, where we proactively market specialist providers just like you to real decision makers in companies across the UK who are ready to buy from external suppliers. And if you use the code podcast at checkout, all caps, you'll also get a free corporate priorities calendar that you can use to understand exactly what decision makers are prioritizing at each point in the year so that you can create solutions that sell all year round as well. All you have to do is visit www.expertservicesdirectory.com and enter the code podcast, all in capital letters, at the checkout now. Right, let's get back to the episode. Welcome to the Selling to Corporate podcast, where we're going to be challenging your sales beliefs around selling to corporate organizations and help you increase your bottom line profits every single month. I am Jessica Lorimer, your sales expert and guide in this world of selling to corporate companies, skyrocketing your company sales and making the impact that you really want in the world. Now, don't forget, if you do enjoy the show today, please do head over to iTunes and leave us a review. But enjoy this episode, and I am really looking forward to sharing some epic sales wisdom with you. Here we are, the end of Q1. Well, technically, by the time that this episode airs, the beginning of Q2, which feels so strange because that means we are officially already 3 months in to 2026. And that has flown by. I don't know about you, but as I'm recording this, I am looking out my office window. I'm looking at the beehive, which is currently full of bees, slightly panicking that I'm going to have to build a second beehive this afternoon instead of doing the work that I actually need to do in case the bees decide to do something hilarious like swarm. Side note, the kind of cool thing about my office at home is that I get to watch the bees on their flight path. So I do any kind of work, and if I need any kind of relaxation, I turn to the right and I look at all the bees flying around, which is relaxing, unless, of course, they swarm, in which case would be horrifying. Like some kind of scene out of a terrifying film. But at the moment, relaxing. And it's reminding me that we have officially hit spring because the bees don't leave their hive unless the temperature is going to be steady and consistent over 10 degrees. So, full of not only sales facts, but bee facts too today. Now, I can't quite believe that we are at the end of Q1 in the calendar year. And it's interesting because for me, my financial year actually ends at the end of November. So for me, I'm actually 4 months in instead of 3 months. And one of the things that I always sit down and do at the end of every single quarter is look at how we're performing year on year. Are we meeting and exceeding what we did last year? And that's across a few things. It's not just revenue overall, but also things like average transaction value. Have we stayed the same? Have we increased with inflation? Or have we exceeded expectations in terms of average transaction value, number of clients, and the type of work that we're doing? And Q1 this year has been really interesting because in my review, it's always interesting because there are a few things that have changed. And, for me, the corporate work that I've been doing has been far more strategic and far more focused around sales leaders rather than standard training, which is a shift in terms of where we were in Q1 last year. So that's been really interesting. It's also been really interesting when we reflect on client results. And actually, some of our clients have been, even in the last 2 weeks, seeing incredible results. We had somebody who sent a little winning post to we have a private WhatsApp community for the C-suite this year. And they said that they'd used my end of play email inside the C-suite to get a proposal accepted at £31,000, which I think is incredible. That's an incredible sale. That's an incredible win for them. We also had somebody who had an existing client who they had talked about for support for other leaders in the organization and had that signed off. We've had people who've had really good business development calls for 14 people training and coaching programs. And, there's been lots and lots going on. And I think that we can often forget and get caught up in the negativity because we don't hear a lot about the positives. And actually, when I look at Q1, I think that there are lots and lots of positives, certainly in and across my business and my clients' businesses. And I hope that that is the same for you as well. And if it isn't, then maybe today's episode will help you to understand what you need to do next. Because I think that this is the time, and you can consider this my caring kick in the pants, if you will. This is the time to step up and take action. I think a lot of 2025, people got caught up in the overall feeling of the year. And I'm somebody who actually removed myself from a lot of social media in 2025. So, especially towards the end, because I found that it was having such a negative impact on me. And there are lots of things, I've mentioned this in other podcast episodes, there were lots of things that were going on for myself personally last year that meant that the added noise of social media just wasn't adding any value, didn't do anything for me. And what has been interesting about Q1 2026 is that social media remains just as noisy, but I've been a lot less focused and interested in it. And that has really helped because, especially over the last couple of weeks, and I'm conscious of where I'm recording this episode, the online space has been incredibly difficult to navigate. And there have been some incredibly challenging themes that have come up. And that's meant that a lot of people have spent a lot of time and a lot of energy on social media doing valuable education work, but unpaid. And I think that is, for me, as somebody who wants to see coaches and consultants and experts be paid for the value that they add, that's been really tough. Hearing about that and hearing about the amount of time and energy that people are spending and having to spend on educating, to a lot of degrees, ignorance for free is, I find that very sad. And actually, for me, stepping back from social media is probably one of the best things I've ever done for not only my business, but my mental health and resilience as well, is being able to step back and knowing which conversations I just don't want to be part of and just don't add value to me. But it is interesting because even though that unpaid education is valuable, super, super valuable and important, it also means that there are lots of coaches, consultants, and experts out there who've spent so much time on that work that they have actively lost revenue in their own business. And for me, that feels unfair, but it's also reflective of, I think, where we sat in 2025 and where people are at risk of sitting in 2026, which is of negative revenue changes and income plateaus and ultimately revenue drops. And it's interesting because in 2025, I think there was this kind of energy around, well, hold back, see what happens, wait and see, things will change. In 2026, my message to you is very much, this is no longer a wait and see situation. And today's episode is all about understanding why that's no longer the case, and why actually you need to be setting some clear boundaries around your sales process, your dedicated time for sales activities. Because otherwise, let's face it, the time for wait and see is done. And that means that only results come now. And so if we're not taking action, if we're not being and setting boundaries around the way that we operate and looking at regular activities, the problems caused by that are significant. And I don't want people to be impacted by that. So let's talk about how we can combat some of that on today's episode, and maybe give you some more motivation and inspiration for the things that are positive and exciting that could come for you in 2026 if you focus in the right areas. All right. And that is not, by the way, me saying I think anyone who's contributed to online discussions around inclusions has wasted their time. That's really not the case at all. I think it's incredibly valuable work. I am sad that people have not been paid for those contributions. I think that's the overwhelming frustration from me, is that we should pay experts for the value that they add, and social media doesn't reward that, and that's the frustration here. So before we dive into today's episode, I am going to remind you that this episode, like all others in Q1, yay, has been sponsored by the Expert Services Directory, which features 10 specialist experts in each category and location, and specifically supports coaches, consultants, and experts to attract qualified inbound inquiries. And the Expert Services Directory has had a really interesting Q1. I am about to start prepping our reporting, because every quarter, unlike other directories, every quarter we sit down and we go through every single person's listing on the directory, and we send out their metrics to every single person in the directory. So if you sign up using the code podcast at checkout, every single quarter you will get an email from me that says, this is exactly how many views that your listing has had, this is exactly how many inquiries your listing has had. And if you sign up for Directory Plus and you've written any blogs or articles for the Expert Services Directory, you will also get metrics around how many people have been using, looking at, and ultimately moving from your blog articles across to your directory listing as well. So it's a very complex endeavor, and it does take a lot of time. Part of me, when I thought about the Expert Services Directory, was like, that'll be so simple. It'll be like a 5-minute job. It is, in fact, not a 5-minute job. It does take a significant amount of time, but I think it's really worth it. And here's why. Because every single quarter, there are things that change in organizations. And again, unlike other directories, at the Expert Services Directory, we think that you should be able to change your listing depending on what you know is important to organizations at that point of time. And actually, one of the free gifts that you get if you do sign up for the Expert Services Directory and enter the code podcast at the checkout is a resource to help you know exactly what organizations are focused on at that period in time of the year, so that you can make up to 3 changes per year of your listing completely free of charge. And all of those changes are reviewed directly by me. So I will always come back to you if there are things that I think would be worth changing or noting, or different keywords that would be applicable. And that really, really helps people have that flexibility to ultimately have a listing that is working for them in multiple ways throughout the year. So that's not just a one and done, here's your listing, that's it for 12 months, off you go. This is the ability for you to be able to tailor your listing to what you know is going on inside organizations. And if you don't know, we've given you a resource that will help you understand every single month what is actually important to organizations. You even get a little email from me every single month reminding you what's important to organizations and how you can be using your listing to do various things outside of simply attracting new leads and inquiries as well. So if you haven't signed up for the Expert Services Directory yet, make sure you do. I talk about this quite a lot, but we are going to hit that VAT threshold soon. So the price will be going up. because we will have to add VAT. So if you haven't signed yourself up yet, make sure you do. And that gives you access to a listing inside the directory for 12 whole months. It gives you access to promotional guidance, resources, and of course, the resource that I've just mentioned, where every single month is laid out for you in terms of the priorities of corporate organisations then and there. It also gives you access to any of the trainings that we do specifically for expert services directory listees. And there is one coming up in April that I'm running on using directory listings to attract specifically new and cold leads. So it gives you access to all of that, plus your listing and proactive marketing and your features in AI search as well, which seems like an absolute steal for £500 or £800 if you decide to go Directory Plus and create blogs and articles and get independent marketing each quarter. So yeah, that's quite the significant amount of resources for a very small amount in terms of price. So let's talk about Q1 then, and let's also blend this in with an understanding of what's been happening in the market recently. Because we're in a phenomenon at the moment, and I talked about this recently in an email. I had lots of emails back about it from some people who agreed and from some people who were like, no, Jess, this is not what I want to hear. I think you could use the word maybe triggered by some of the things I talked about. But we're in this phenomenon, and it's a relatively common business phenomenon called race to the bottom. And the race to the bottom simply means being in a time period where companies or countries, and that's really important, are reducing significantly things like wages, prices, standards, regulations, even things like environmental protections, essentially, where countries and companies are cost cutting so that they can attract new customers. Now, you'll have seen this because if you lived through 2008, 2011, you'll have seen a lot of this. If you have studied business at all, you would have heard about this phenomenon quite regularly. You will also be seeing this just in terms of certain utilities and things that you'll have used over the years. Things like broadband, phone contracts, utilities around electricity, anything where a new provider can bring you something a little bit cheaper. Now, a few years ago, this kind of race to the bottom, it impacted a global organization rapidly. So for those of you who know the retail world, you will have no doubt, and if you had teenagers at the time, you will also have no doubt, have heard of Boohoo.com. Now, they were an e-commerce brand. They rapidly hit the market and almost exploded. And they were worth, I think it was something like 4 billion at the time. They were valued at 4 billion. But unfortunately, in order to keep up, they had to scale their operations. And what they did by scaling their operations was realize that a lot of their operations were not sustainable with the standards and regulations that they were adhering to. So eventually there was an expose which talked about the fact that Boohoo.com were not paying staff fairly, and they were not adhering to standards around working regulations in certain places and things. And that actually catapulted them into this situation where the company ended up being financially, I think it was in a matter of weeks, that their valuation had gone from like 4 billion to like 1.5. Now, I know that's relatively small potatoes if you're still in the millions, but what ended up happening was that when we looked at the Boohoo situation, it entered severe financial distress and a huge, huge drop in the value. So what ended up happening was that it had to rebrand, and it essentially had to move to a new model, and it continues to lose money, and its valuation is significantly lower than the 4 billion previously. And that's interesting because we often talk about companies, doing all these things and not caring and not being interested. A lot of the time we forget the part that consumers have to play in things like sustainability and fair wages and all of those kinds of things. Because if consumers don't buy from brands who have these poorly regulated environments and standards, then ultimately things happen. The changes are made as a result. And we forget that. We forget that the power that we have, the buying power that we have, does significantly impact the way that companies have to operate and the standards that they have to and are incentivized to meet in order to keep their customer base. And that's really where I'm starting today's conversation, because one of the interesting things that happens, and we do see a lot with companies where they will often in economic downturns or specific environments, they will start to do things that will incentivize customers to stay with them. And a lot of it comes down to cost cutting. Where can we cut costs? Where can we shave costs? Where can we provide more of a discount to customers? Now, you might be listening to this being like, Jess, in the wake of the price of oil going up significantly and petrol and inflation and everything else, I don't believe that to be true. And that's fine. You can go and look for examples yourself. I'm not here to sell you on companies are the best, most ethical things in the world. I'm simply here to explain what happens when this race to the bottom phenomenon happens, and specifically what happens to entrepreneurs at this time, because that, let's face it, is why you're here. That's what's important to you. So we do see companies in these sorts of economic downturns and challenging environments, we see them looking for ways that they can cut costs so that they can be more profitable, so that they can win and acquire new customers, so that they can even acquire other businesses. And despite what happens politically, that may or may not see those cost-cutting measures passed on directly to consumers, this all happens behind the scenes, and it's a well-known and well-documented business. I keep calling it phenomenon because it is, but it's a very awkward word to keep saying, if I'm honest. So we do see this regularly in these times of financial downturn and crises. But I don't think we talk about it a lot in the entrepreneurial space. And actually, that's where, for me as a small business owner, and for you as a small business owner, that's where it's most important. Because this idea, this race to the bottom, and the reason that I talked about it earlier, about countries and companies do this, is because it's not just an organisational. But the reason it's so important as an entrepreneur is to understand what this actually entails. And it's not just about companies cutting wages. It's also about countries reducing standards and regulations. And they can be around anything: sustainability, living wages, operating conditions, can be anything. But that's what companies then benefit from. It's how they're able to find these cost-cutting measures. And in the entrepreneurial world, I kind of feel the same about it. And I have for a while. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. What I haven't maybe framed for you before is this idea of the race to the bottom and what that actually means for you. So if you step back and you looked at the online marketing space, for example, or the online education space as its own entity, we can see that over the last 5 years, things have changed significantly, right? We've had the kind of boom of everyone selling 20K, 30K mastermind programs. My opinion is that a lot of that is highly inflated, but we are. And then we've had interesting markets, like the one that we're in now, where suddenly people's disposable income has become squeezed. And so everyone and their, I was going to say dog, but cat, goldfish, whatever animal you choose, everyone has been trying to reduce their prices. And they're talking about it and framing it in a way that actually I don't think is helpful. what we're hearing is that people are saying, I don't need to make lots of money anymore. I'm going to focus on impact. And I think that's dangerous. And I say that as the person who in 2015, I used to say, impact and income, they go hand in hand. And I used to talk a lot about creating both impact and income. For me, it's really important that you do both. I don't think that you should only focus on one. Because to reference my point earlier, there are lots of people who've made significant impact and given significant amounts of education around lots of different topics and areas of specialism for free. Now, whilst they might be making an impact in the world, and a positive one at that, that's not actually reflected in their day-to-day life or rewarded or sometimes even recognised. So I think that this culture of let's focus on impact isn't necessarily the flex that people think it is. Because actually what we're seeing is that is covering up a worrying trend, specifically in the online education space. A worrying trend of lower revenues, smaller launches, people not being able to convert at the same rate, everybody selling to the same people and hoping that they're going to buy. Essentially, the online space has entered a race to the bottom. And that means that people have compromised quality of service. They have lowered their pricing. They have compromised regulations and standards. In some places, they're even compromising core beliefs that I think are really serious around equality, around diversity, around discrimination. That is exactly representative of what race to the bottom looks like if you considered the online space as its own entity. And worryingly, that is feeding into a number of different areas for coaches, consultants, and experts who are now having to recover and try and sell to corporates because they've realised that selling B2C is no longer commercially viable and that it is difficult. And that despite the impact that they want to make, their bank manager wants to be paid with actual income. And so it isn't working in the same way that it once was. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm making some grand prediction about what will happen to the online space. I don't know. And honestly, I'm not really that interested. I've talked to a lot of people recently about my time out of social media and the fact that I've shut down programs over the last couple of years because I want to spend more time on my corporate consultancy, on the expert services directory, and why that's been the case. And I use the same answer for everybody. I've never entered my own business to be a content creator. And that is what the online education space requires, and it's not something I want to do. So I don't anymore. That's it. That's as simple as the answer gets, right? But it's interesting because what we are seeing is that as a result of this race to the bottom mentality where people are cutting their prices, they're trying to do everything at discounted rates, they are, working often without or in unregulated areas. I know that there'll be a lot of coaches who listen to this who are eminently frustrated that they've worked through their ICF or other accredited sources of coaching to lose out to people who are good marketers, but ultimately working in areas like trauma, for example, where they should have further qualifications than they do. And they're, damaging people's mental health and various other aspects of their lives. So I know that this conversation happens, but it's interesting because that's putting a strain onto the B2B market. And it's doing it for two reasons. One is, and I've been talking about this for about 18 months, that lots of people are recognizing that selling B2C is not the lucrative model that it used to be. And, that it isn't a case of getting 200 people in a program anymore and not really doing that much to help them out. So they're deciding to move to sell to corporates which is putting an influx of, people into that B2B space, which means that people who are and have been selling to corporates for a long time and are qualified to do so are finding that there are more competitors in that or in those spaces, which is fine. Competition is a good thing. However, because these people are bringing across this race to the bottom mentality from the online space, it's causing other issues that are perhaps more difficult. So the first thing is quality of service. We're seeing a lot of people who haven't ever been interested in selling to corporates before now try and sell to corporates. And they're bringing across the same mentality around, I don't really need to do that much. I just need to make the sale and keep marketing. That doesn't fly when you work with corporate organizations. It doesn't fly at all. And not being able to provide the transformation that you have outlined or promised means that not only do you run the risk of not creating a result for the organization and they won't use you again, but it also means that a lot of other people who are qualified are having to pick up the slack. So instead of creating impact and income, these people are arguably creating more work for people inside the company, potentially more damage to people inside the company, and then making it difficult for other suppliers or external suppliers to come in and help a company trust them after they've had that bad experience. That's not great, right? That's difficult. It means that people like you and I are having to rely ever more on tight sales processes, on showcasing in the sales process how trust is built and credibility. And I'm not talking about, credibility as being these are all the qualifications I have, or this is my 30-second pitch and it sounds amazing. I'm talking about how we run our sales calls to demonstrate that we have the critical thinking ability to be able to help them create an experience that actually will challenge perceptions, change behaviors, do these kinds of things. Right? So that is a change. The second thing that we're seeing is that this idea of lower pricing is coming in. And this is an interesting one because I talk about this a lot. Usually it's unpopular, but I hear a lot from entrepreneurs, companies just don't want to pay that much. And, absolutely, I'll be the first person to say that organizations are always looking for what could be a win-win. What's a good deal for them and for you? What is interesting, though, is that your pricing and every single one of your competitors or peers, their pricing directly impacts how much a company thinks the benchmark should be for those pieces of work or those programs of work. That's right. Your pricing, your competitors' pricing, my pricing, other peers in the market, their pricing. It all contributes and builds a picture for organizations, especially organizations who are benchmarking. So if they're going out and saying, okay, we need to get 3 prices, and they get 2 prices from people who are brand new to market, who are bringing in this mentality of just got to charge anything to get the sale. And then they look at your pricing that is premium because it's considered with the amount of time, energy, effort that's going to need to go into creating the solution and the expertise to deliver it. They're always going to say to you, well, your price is high. How come you're so high? Right? We've got other people that are lower in price. What's the deal with yours? Right? So this lower pricing across the board that is actually being set by coaches, by consultants, by experts themselves is contributing to this feedback loop that we're getting from organizations who are saying, we just don't have budget for that, or, we've benchmarked and that's really not the price that we were expecting to pay. It's creating that loop. Now, that doesn't mean it's insurmountable. Obviously, I talked at the beginning of this episode about clients of mine who are signing high ticket premium programs and services with corporate organizations. That still exists. But it's to say that the inexperienced salesperson is finding it very difficult to convert those opportunities because of the lack of quality service being provided by people newer to market who are not taking the time, energy, and effort to understand how to put together pieces or programs of work that are going to get the transformation, or who are better marketers and sellers than they are deliverers. But also this idea of lower pricing across the board because everyone's worried about the economic downturn. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because I've worked with a lot of corporate clients over the last 14 years. I couldn't tell you how many. I had a couple recently who said to me, oh, we're going to be benchmarking services at the end of, financial years and stuff. And we looked at it, and I have always openly said to my corporate clients that I'm not the cheapest resource. But the reason that I'm not is because I'm really, really good at what I do, and I've got a really good success rate and those sorts of things. And so a couple of companies that I work with actually involved me in their processes to understand what was out there. And we looked at, and just to be clear, nobody has shared any confidential information with me on this. It's not like I've had access to loads of other training companies and all their pricing. But we talked about the features, what was being offered in these new deals that were coming up to very clearly win business. So we talked about a lot of the features. And we also talked about the level of trainer or consultant that was being allocated to these resources, because that's also interesting, right? A lot of companies have been burnt before by the fact that certainly large consultancies will have a graduate training program. They might have somebody who's 22 to 25 who's never actually worked in an organization of that size, or certainly on those projects, who is then coming in and making exceptionally big and difficult decisions about how company budget is allocated, where resources are allocated, how permanent headcount is cut or expanded. People who are reliant solely on the training program that they've been through, not through real lived experience of those situations. And so these are some of the things that are coming up when companies are looking at these benchmarks, but they're also not things that we're talking about in sales processes, because everyone's so desperate to win the work that they just compete on price, and they forget about quality of service, and they forget about credibility, and they forget about lived experience and all the other things that go into creating an experience for an organization that actually gets the results that it's designed for, or sets them up in the very best way to achieve that result. Yeah. The final thing that we see this race to the bottom causing for entrepreneurs is this idea of the quick win. There's lots of people at the moment who are focused on the quick win. And it was interesting because a client of mine asked me a really clever question recently. They said, Jess, what do people need to do in economic downturns? Should we be, focusing on different sales activities? Should we be doing something differently? The reality is what we see at the moment, because we are in an economic downturn, you don't have to be an economist to understand that. But what we see in the moment is a lot of people who are focusing on the buzzwords, right? What can we do or sell that's new, that's exciting? Of course, the buzz word at the moment is AI, and also LLM around language models, which if you're having discussions about AI, you will know what LLM means way better than I do. But we're seeing this a lot, especially in that online education space. We're seeing people who are putting all of their intellectual property into these LLM spaces and creating, their own agents to sell to clients. And, that's interesting. It's an interesting concept. And I'm sure that it's selling, well, for now. But it's also interesting because we live in a society where people have this critical thought, and we have a lot of people who are very focused on environment and sustainability. And we know that AI is not, especially when used badly, is not good for the environment because of the amount of water that it uses and how large the data centers are. And there are stats around like some of these data centers are taking more electricity than certain towns in the US, which is unbelievable. So from a sustainability perspective, both environmentally and just can it continue? I don't know. Those are big questions that people who are much more experienced with AI than I will be talking about and trying to answer over the next few years. Incidentally, there's only a couple of people that I would trust the opinions of when it comes to AI or LLM. If you are interested in those topics, please let me know. I will refer you because I think it's more important than ever that we don't just jump on a quick win. We look at what is it that we're actually trying to achieve, and are we the person that's best placed to sell something? For me, when it comes to AI, absolutely not. I am a veritable dinosaur when it comes to understanding and using it as a tool. Certainly when it comes to anything outside of automation and process. And so there are people that I would much prefer to recommend. Incidentally, none of them are big name online influencers either, because we're talking about people who've spent their entire careers looking at AI and the specifics around it. I digress. Obviously, I'm just talking about AI now, and realistically, that's not the point of this episode. But if you need to know anyone who is actually qualified in that area, let me know, and I'll refer you. But it is these quick wins that people are looking for to sell because they just need to sell anything. And that's something that we have to be wary of as consumers. Is this person selling something because they're qualified to sell it? Is it actually something that, has the potential to work? So doing your due diligence as a consumer. But it's also something that we have to watch as a market, because otherwise it can be quite tempting to focus on all the what should be quick wins and new things instead of doing what I referred this particular client to, which is honing and doubling down on your existing proven sales process that works. Now, if you don't have an existing proven sales process that works, you need to learn one. ASAP. It's never been more critical, because otherwise your business will literally be thrown into this feast-famine roller coaster that everybody tells me they hate, because you will only be focusing on panic selling and probably at low rates to compete with the market, to then end up with a significant amount of delivery, which means you have no time for business development, which plunges you then, after that delivery is finished, into having no clients, and the same situation occurring again and again and again and again and again. Instead, what we have to do is stop focusing on all the shiny things that could be a win, that could create results, and actually focus on the things in your sales process that are guaranteed to, like generating consistent qualified leads every single month, like honing your sales calls and the questions that you ask on sales calls, so that you know that at least 75% of those calls turn into qualified proposals. Having a proposal process that means that you can actively measure and predict how many proposals are going to come off. And spoiler, it's only 1 in 4. That's what the average statistic is for the average person who knows sales training. That's what you're most likely to close, 1 in 4 proposals. Now, my clients are closing over 75%. So they're doing a lot less work to generate significantly more in terms of revenue. And it's this focus on how we can double down on our sales process, how we can make things the most efficient, the most effective that they can be. That's what makes the difference in this market, when everyone else is racing to the bottom, competing on price, competing on quality, competing on what shiny new thing can they add. The stalwarts like me, we're not. We're raising our prices. We're selling at premium levels. We're delivering. premium levels of transformation for organizations. We're getting more repeat work than ever because companies see the value that we're able to add inside organizations and they want more. And we're winning more market share. And we're panicking less. If that's what you want, you have to create a sales process now that allows it. It has to start. Because otherwise, what we are going to see, and it's going to be really sad, and it's already started, you'll know entrepreneurs who've suffered from this, either from shutting down their business because of a lack of revenue, or shutting down their business because they were burnt out, because they were selling things at low rates and having way too much delivery to have to do, that they just burn out. You'll already see this. That's what we know and understand from the race to the bottom. So how do you know if your Q1 has been impacted by this race to the bottom phenomenon? Well, you have to think about your business personally. So I'd ask yourself a couple of questions. And if you've answered yes to one or more of these, it's time for you to take a bit of a reset and think about how your business actually, how you want it to look by the end of this year, because there is still time. There's not unlimited amounts of time until the end of this year. We've only got 9 months, which is crazy to me. But it seems like I say it every year, and every year people think, I'll just do it when summer comes. I'll just do it when September gets here. I'll just do it in November. We don't have unlimited time this year. The market, the economy, everything has already changed. So if you are answering yes to one or more of these questions, you need to make changes now, not in 2 weeks, not after Easter, not in a couple of months when things are less busy. Because if you don't change your sales process now, you're never going to be less busy if you're charging less for what you're delivering, because you won't have the capacity or time to be able to do that, right? So how can you tell if you've impacted in Q1? Here are the questions that you want to ask yourself. Like I say, if you've answered yes to one or more, it's not a judgment on you. It's an opportunity to be mindful, to reset, to think about what you want your sales process to actually look like and what results you actually want, so that you can build a sales process that works. Okay. So number one is, have you lowered your prices or tried to create cheaper offers or avoided increasing your rates over the last 6 to 12 months? Okay. So if you have lowered your prices, tried to create cheaper offers in the hope that companies will buy them, or avoided increasing your rates in the last 6 to 12 months, that is a way that you're being impacted by the race to the bottom and by public feeling around companies only wanting to buy things that are cheap. Okay. Or an indication primarily that your sales process isn't working because you're only feeling like you're able to sell things that are cheaper in price rather than higher in terms of transformation. The second thing is asking yourself, have I accepted there's no budget, there's a lower budget, we just don't have budget in the last 3 months? And the reason that I talk about the last 3 months is because financial year end is one of the most lucrative times of the year to sell to companies. It is when they want to spend money because they want to use it or lose it. So if you have been bowing down to pressures, from companies, or avoiding talking about budget expectations, or believing that companies, when they say we don't have budget, there's no budget, and you haven't been challenging or talking through those things, that's a way that you're being impacted by the race to the bottom. Again, it's also indicative that your sales process is not currently set up for the market, because in this market, we are going to have honest and transparent conversations around things like budgets to be able to manage client expectations, to be able to set boundaries around our sales process, to be able to convert at better rates. Number 3 is, has your revenue plateaued this quarter, or has your revenue decreased this quarter? Now, that was best to look at year on year. So in comparison to 2025, has your revenue decreased in Q1 of 2026 versus 2025? again, it's indicative of the race to the bottom thing that is happening, but also your sales process not being geared up. And it's a good idea then, if you are experiencing that, to figure out, okay, where is it in my sales process that things are broken? And again, if you don't know, ask an expert. Ask me. I say to people all the time, you can drop me an email and I will always reply. You can message me on LinkedIn and say, hey, Jess, this is, this is what my numbers look like. I've got zero judgment at all, but I will recommend you to resources that will help make a difference for you. And that's the trade-off. I will recommend free podcast episodes. I might recommend a certain program. I might recommend a listing in the expert services directory. Won't always be paid stuff, but the trade-off is, if I'm giving you advice, I expect you to go and have a look at the resources that I recommend that are going to make the difference and actually consume them. I recommend podcast episodes to people all the time. And then people are surprised when I check in and say, hey, did you manage to listen to those? How did it go? So just be aware, if you do message me, you are letting yourself in for me, A, making recommendations, and B, following up and seeing whether you actually went and listened to any of them. Question 4 is, has your marketing increased, but your revenue either hasn't changed or has gone down? What I mean by marketing is, has your content creation increased? Has your ad spend on any platform increased? Has the amount of time that you are allocating in your week to visibility and brand awareness, has that increased, but your revenue has actually plateaued or gone down? If it has, then, A, it's a problem and indicative of the race to the bottom piece and how you're being caught up in what everyone else is doing. And this idea that we all should just post more on social media and that will get us more clients. But also be indicative that your sales process is not set up outside of marketing, because your focus is on visibility rather than converting clients. And you may be using marketing to try and convert clients, but that's not actually what's there and designed to do. Okay, so it's knowing the difference and thinking about whether your sales enablement plan is in place. And then finally, the final question is, have you started relying on AI or peers for strategic support rather than working with experts in the field? And this is an interesting one. And I know that there are going to be people who listen to this and think, oh, Jess, that's a really uncomfortable thing to say. And it's uncomfortable even for me to say. But the reality is that, and I recorded a podcast episode on peer networks a couple of weeks ago. If you haven't listened to it, go back and listen to it. It is not me saying you shouldn't have peer support groups. I think you absolutely should. It's really useful. I think that what we're using them for can be indicative that our sales process isn't working. And people are often using peer support groups and AI or LLM models. Just realised that the M in LLM stands for models, but you know where we're going with this. People are often using those instead of getting expert tailored advice, strategic guidance for their business. And I know that there'll be people who say, but Jess, I have set up my insert OpenAI, open source AI model here to understand my intellectual property, to understand my business, to know my numbers, to have all these things. So it's making decisions that are bespoke and tailored. And it might be, but it is only as good as what is going into it. And the best strategic thinkers with the most lived experience in areas like marketing and communications and finance and sales are not going in and feeding any kind of open source AI with their plans that they are creating for clients who are in similar spaces to you. So it's knowing and applying critical thought to what you're doing. That's not to say you shouldn't use it. Absolutely you should. I have been contributing to a lot of research recently on AI in the sales space specifically. I think there are some amazing things that it can do. Do I think it should be in charge of recommending strategies to people who are then solely reliant on the AI, A, knowing what they're supposed to be doing, but B, troubleshooting when it doesn't go right? And the answer is no. No, I don't believe that. I think it's really, really dangerous to outsource your critical thinking to essentially a series of codes. um, and so do a lot of experienced people in the space. You know, there was a report I reference quite often produced by Microsoft, who have their own platform called The Impact of Generative AI on Critical Thinking. If you haven't read that report, I would go and read it. And it talked about the loss of critical thinking skills and productivity caused. So if you have answered that question around have you started using or relying on AI or peer support networks instead of getting expert advice and guidance, that is indicative that you know, your revenue is perhaps not where you want it to be because you're relying on free resource networks, which, like I say, not a problem as long as they're performing the function that they should be, and indicative that your sales process needs work, but also is indicative that you are going to be in some ways contributing to some of the difficulties that we see around the race to the bottom. So, for example, if you're somebody who's plugging in every session that you're winning with corporate clients, every training session, you plug it into AI and saying, what can I do? What examples shall I use? What kind of exercises should I do? And I've been seeing this recently, and it does make me sad, because that's not what corporate organizations are paying for. They're paying for you to be able to go in and use your expertise and lived experience to deliver transformation. Again, fine to use for inspiration, but I wouldn't be planning out client work using it. Then that is a contribution to some of those points we talked about earlier around lack of due care and quality and service provision, you know, because we don't know where that information goes. And a lot of us don't know what anyone else is plugging into these models and whether they're naming companies, whether they're talking through difficult situations that they're experiencing, you know, outside of the sales process that could be considered confidential information that then is available for somebody with a good prompt and a lot of time to get access to. All right. So something to think about. As ever, if this conversation has been interesting for you, please let me know. I am always, well, I say I'm always in my inbox. I'm not. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays. I'm usually in my inbox looking at emails and responding to things, and the same on LinkedIn. So if you do want to let me know anything that's come up for you from this episode, please feel free to reach out there. I will see you in a couple of weeks. It will be after the Easter break here in the UK, and I think I'll be feeling hopefully relatively tanned. We're actually taking a few days out. We're going to go to France and have a little bit of a trip. We're trying to make the most of some short breaks at the moment because Owen has some commitments with the army at the end of this year, which mean that he won't be able to take breaks, but I am making the most of it before he goes. Have a really, really lovely rest of your day and enjoy the upcoming time off for the Easter break if that is something that you celebrate. And if not, I hope that you enjoy having some time to reflect on Q1 and how it has gone for you and setting in place plans for the rest of 2026. I'll see you in the next episode.